beware. Once they had agreed to cast a spell on Nancy, Bean stared long and hard at Ivy's robe. Those little pieces of paper had to go. The first thing we have to do is make you look more like a witch, she said. Ivy looked down at her bathrobe. Why? Bean tried to explain without hurting Ivy's feelings. If you want other people to believe you're a witch, you have to look more witchy. But I don't care if other people believe me, said Ivy. Bean shook her head. What a weird kid. It'll make your spells better, too. You've got to dress for success. Her mother said that all the time. It usually meant that Bean had to put on a clean shirt. Besides, it'll be fun. Do you have face paint? Ivy nodded. In my room upstairs. She pointed to a window. Is your mom inside? Bean asked. I guess, said Ivy. Is she going to tell my mom where I am? Grown-ups stuck together that way. Bean's dad said it was because they were all in a club together, but Bean felt pretty sure he was making that up. Ivy tapped her wand against her hand. Maybe we should sneak in, just to be sure. That was fine with Bean. She loved sneaking. She loved face paint, too. And she was really going to love watching Nancy kick her legs and wave her arms for the rest of her life. They went in the back door to the kitchen. Bean could hear Ivy's mom talking on the telephone somewhere in the house. This is going to be easy, whispered Ivy. She's working. She yelled loudly, Hi, Mom, can I have a banana? Hang on a second, Bean heard Ivy's mom say. Then to Ivy, she said, Honey, I'm on the phone. Get your own banana. There was the sound of a door shutting. Okay, yelled Ivy. She smiled at Bean. See? Very tricky, thought Bean. Ivy was turning out to be a lot more interesting than she had expected. They walked softly past Ivy's mom's door and up the stairs. They were very quiet. At the top of the stairs, there was a door with a sign that said, Beware, in red glitter glue letters. That was Ivy's room. When she went in, Bean stood still and looked all around. This is way, way cool, she said. She had never seen a room like Ivy's. There were thick lines drawn on the floor, marking out 5 sections. Each section was like a different room. In one section, there was a small sofa on a rug and a bookcase stuffed with books. In another was a table covered with pens and paper and glitter glue and paint. Ivy's bed with a canopy made of silver netting was in another. A dresser and a folded screen painted with clouds were in the 4th section. The 5th section had nothing in it except dolls. Bean had never seen so many dolls in her life. They were the regular kind of plastic dolls. There were weird staring dolls with fancy costumes that were kept in glass cases at the toy store. There were stiff wooden dolls. There were china dolls, small ones, smaller ones, and tiny ones. There was one doll that was really a rock dressed in clothes. All the dolls were seated around a doll-sized blanket. Even the mushy baby dolls that couldn't sit by themselves had been propped up with blocks. In the middle of the blanket lay a Barbie doll, wrapped up in toilet paper. All the other dolls were watching her. Neat, said Bean. A mummy. Yeah, said Ivy. I'm going to build a pyramid to bury her in, as soon as I figure out how. I know how, said Bean. Nancy made one out of sugar cubes last year. I can't believe your parents let you draw lines on your floor. It's only chalk, said Ivy. It comes off. I changed the lines when I changed the rooms. For now, I'm thinking about getting rid of the dressing room and making it into a kitchen. Is that one the dressing room? Asked Bean, pointing to the section with the dresser and the folding screen. Yeah. I like the screen, said Bean, but a kitchen's a little bit boring. Maybe you could turn it into a science lab for making potions. The screen could protect your secrets. A lab, said Ivy, thinking. A witch's lab. That's a pretty good idea. Bean looked over to the table with the paint and the glitter glue. What's that room called? She asked. That's my art studio, said Ivy. Cool, said Bean. Let's fix up your wand. In Ivy's art studio, there were plenty of sequins and jewels and streamers and pipe cleaners. First, they wrapped the wand with silver pipe cleaners. Then, Bean attached streamers to the end. Then, Ivy put some stickers on. Then Bean put plain glue on the top and dipped it in a jar of glitter. She stuck a big red jewel on the top. The wand dripped a little, but it looked much, much more magic than it had before. "Now," said Bean, when that was done, "let's work on your robe." "What's the matter with it?" asked Ivy. "All the stars and moons are coming off. See?" Bean pointed. "It will look better if we draw them on with sparkly markers." Ivy looked embarrassed. "I can't draw stars very well." "I can," said Bean. "I'll teach you." Bean showed Ivy how to draw dots for the star points, then connect the dots with lines. Ivy practiced on paper for a while, and then they stretched the bathrobe over the table and began drawing. Ivy's stars were a little bent, but they all had 5 points. Soon the black robe was covered with silver stars and gold moons. Once that was done, Ivy got out her face paint. Bean couldn't believe it. The set had 24 colors. "Wow, let's do green stripes," said Bean, "or green dots." There were 3 different greens. "No, witches are only green in movies," said Ivy. "Real witches are just regular colored." "But you've got all this great face paint," said Bean. "We've got to use it for something." Ivy thought, "You can put black around my eyes." "Okay, but aren't real witches kind of pale because they go out mostly at night?" asked Bean. "I guess," said Ivy, "kind of pale, but not green." "My mom knew a guy who turned green. It was because he watched TV all the time," said Bean. But she could tell that she wasn't changing Ivy's mind. "What if we did all white with black around your eyes?" she suggested. "Yeah," Ivy nodded, "with a couple blobs of red on my cheeks for blood." "That's good," Bean agreed. "Blood is good." So Bean carefully smeared white all over Ivy's face except her lips. Then she drew red drops down her cheeks. They didn't really look like blood. They looked more like red tears. But that was a pretty scary thing, too. Then Bean drew thick black lines around Ivy's eyes. Both girls thought that witches' hats were dorky, so they wrapped Ivy's head in a black scarf, borrowed from her mother's dresser drawer. It looked almost like long black hair. Ivy stared at herself in the dressing room mirror. "Wow," she said, "I look really strange." And she did. Easy peasy. Now they were ready to begin. Ivy went to the bedroom section of her room and pulled a cardboard box out from under her bed. Then she looked at Bean. "This part is really secret," she said. "I promise I won't tell anyone," said Bean. Ivy opened the box and took out a square thing wrapped in pink silky cloth. It was her spell book. Bean thought that a spell book would be mysterious looking, with a magic sign on the cover or something. But this spell book was plain black. It was old, though. Ivy said it was almost 100 years old. The pages were yellowish. "Where'd you get it?" Bean whispered. "My aunt gave it to me," Ivy said. "Is she one?" asked Bean. "She says she isn't," said Ivy, "but I'm not so sure." Ivy flipped through the book for the dancing spell. She read it to herself, and then she whispered it, but so low that Bean couldn't hear. Bean didn't mind. Everyone knew that witches' spells were private. After a few minutes, Ivy said, "Got it. It's a pretty easy spell. The only thing we need is worms." Luckily, there were lots of worms in Bean's backyard. Tons. But now they were going to have to sneak into Bean's yard and dig them up, without Nancy seeing. But also luckily, Bean knew how to get into her yard by going through the other backyards on Pancake Court. There was one really gross dog poopy yard, and then there was Mrs. Trance, who didn't like kids in her garden, and there was a lot of climbing. But aside from that, Bean said, it was easy peasy. Ivy put the big black book in her backpack. Bean tucked the wand into her back pocket. It was still a little drippy, but there was nothing Bean could do about that. Carefully, they tiptoed down the stairs. Ivy's mother was still working in her office, and they slipped past her door like quiet ants. Soon, they were moving quickly toward the back fence. Ivy, Bean saw, did not really know how to climb a fence. She just jumped at it, hoping that she would get to the top. Bean showed her how to find the little holes and bumps that make a ladder. When they got to the top, Bean whispered, "This is Ruby and Trevor's house. They have a good sandbox. The good news was that there was a gate on the other side of Ruby and Trevor's yard. The bad news was that it led to the really gross dog poopy yard. Bean and Ivy walked on tiptoes, but still Ivy stepped in some. Fester, the dog whose poop it was, came out to sniff them. He was a nice dog, and he seemed sorry that his yard was so disgusting. The next fence was low and easy, except that the wand fell out of Bean's pocket and she had to go back and get it. Then came Jake the teenager's house. There was loud music with lots of bad words in it coming from the garage. There was no way Jake the teenager was ever going to hear them walking through his backyard. Mrs. Trance was next. Getting into her yard was no problem. Ivy and Bean climbed over the stone wall and dropped down onto her lawn. Everything in Mrs. Trance's yard was perfectly neat. Her tulips were lined up in rows. Her apple tree was tied so that its branches grew flat. Her bird bath had no birds in it. "If Mrs. Trance sees us, she's going to be really mad," said Bean. Bean knew this garden. It was very long, and there was no way to go around it. "Is she going to throw rocks at us?" asked Ivy. She looked a little scared. "No, she just talks, but it's worse than throwing rocks." Bean sighed. "Maybe she's not home." But Mrs. Trance was home. They were halfway across her perfect yard when she came outside. She stood on her patio and glared at them. "Bernice," she said in a high voice, "come here." Bean took a few steps toward the patio. "Closer, please, Bernice. It seems that we need to have another one of our little talks." Ivy came and stood beside Bean, next to the patio. "Who are you?" said Mrs. Trance, frowning at Ivy's white witch face. "My name is Ivy," said Ivy. "Well, Ivy, children are not allowed in my garden. Maybe you can teach your friend Bernice that." Mrs. Trance gave a short, dry laugh. "Because Bernice does not seem to be able to remember it by herself, do you, Bernice?" "I remember, Mrs. Trance, but it was just sort of an emergency," said Bean. "I'm sorry." "Usually when you say you're sorry, people say something nice back to you." Not Mrs. Trance. She said, "I don't think you're sorry, Bernice. If you were sorry, you wouldn't keep coming into my garden when I've asked you not to. Do I need to call your mother again?" She smiled in an unfriendly way. Bean heard Ivy sucking in her breath. "She's about to do something," thought Bean. "I'm going to throw up," Ivy said loudly. "Yuck," thought Bean, whirling around to see. Ivy looked at her and crossed one eye a tiny bit. Bean looked closely at Ivy. Then she said, "That's the emergency I was telling you about, Mrs. Trance." Mrs. Trance looked worried. Ivy burped. It sounded horrible. Mrs. Trance jumped back. "Go! Go home! Run!" "That's what we were trying to do, Mrs. Trance," Bean said sweetly. She was having a good time watching Mrs. Trance's face. "Go! Now!" yelled Mrs. Trance. Ivy gagged. Mrs. Trance ran inside her house and looked at them through a window. She waggled her hand to shoo them away. "We'll be going now, Mrs. Trance," called Bean. She waved goodbye as she and Ivy walked away. Ivy gave one more disgusting burp just for fun. Bean tried to hold her laughs in, but they came out her nose. And then Ivy couldn't hold her laughs in either. It was a good thing they were in the next yard by then. It really was easy peasy after that. They went across Kalia's yard. Kalia was in her high chair at the kitchen window. She waved her spoon at Bean. Bean waved back and then put her finger to her lips. "Shh," she whispered. Finally, they came to Bean's own yard.